And now back to our top story, and to discuss the recommendations of the expert panel on asylum seekers, I was joined just a short time ago from our Parliament House studio by a member of the expert panel, Manus Aristotle, who is a director of the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture. Manus Aristotle, thanks very much for joining us.
Pleasure.
Your organisation still counsels people who are dealing with the mental trauma of being locked up on Nauru. How difficult was it for you to come to the conclusion that that same detention centre should be reopened?
It's an incredibly difficult and challenging thing to try and contemplate, which is why we've made very significant recommendations about making it different to how it was previously. But also, at my centre, we're also providing services to people who lost multiple members of their families in boats that have sunk, where in one case, one client lost 6 members of their family, in another case, 7 members of their families, all who drowned at sea, and the grief and trauma that they've experienced is very compelling also. We also work with refugees from Africa, from Somalia, from Sudan and so forth, who've been through incredibly desperate and difficult circumstances and who are waiting to be reunited with family who've been in camps for many years. So there are many strings to this bow, and none of them are easy to deal with. But what we've proposed is very different to what's happened in the past.
Are you worried, though, that by arguing to reopen these detention centres, that could mean that your organisation will be seeing more people down the track who will need intense counselling from being in these detention centres for long periods of time?
Okay, well, to get one thing clear, we're not recommending opening detention centres. We're certainly recommending that one of the things that must be avoided in any transfer or regional processing arrangement is arbitrary detention. So people will, in our proposal, would not be held in detention in any of those arrangements. That's
so just to clarify that, it wouldn't be like Nauru and Manus Island was before, with fences around it and people being detained?
No. There would have to be accommodation established for them. They may have to return to that accommodation each evening, but it's not intended that it would be a detention centre in any of the proposed transfer arrangements. The other thing that's different to the past is that there were no independent monitoring and oversight mechanisms of what was happening. We've recommended that there be oversight and monitoring mechanisms through high-level groups comprising of cross-party membership, experts from the non-government sector or academia, senior officials who would monitor and oversight the adherence to the conditions of any transfer arrangement and international obligations. We recommended there be legal advice. We recommended a review process and a full suite of services. And in addition to that, we've recommended substantial increase in the humanitarian program that would create more places to be available across a regional processing network. Now, none of those things were in place in the past.
Back in 2005, you wrote a report about Nauru and the people who had suffered mental harm for being on Nauru, and one of the factors you identified back then was the length of the stay. Under the proposal put forward today, how long could asylum seekers be stuck on Nauru and stuck on Manus Island?
Well, that's not possible for me to actually answer clearly, because a lot of it is dependent on getting a complete regional arrangement in place and getting those processing systems functioning more effectively. But what we're saying really is we're not denying anyone the right to seek protection or asylum. That's a fundamental right. What we're saying to people is we want to build a proper set of regional arrangements that would provide a safe way for you to seek protection, and that there is no point in spending $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 on a people smuggler, because you will be transferred back into regional processing arrangements and you will end up with an outcome at roughly the same sort of time frame had you applied elsewhere prior to coming. And that's the general principle that we're seeking to achieve here. We're trying to make it fairer and more balanced and equitable for everyone, not just those who come into our immediate vision.
David Mann has said that some people could end up staying longer than they did under the Pacific solution. Now, in Nauru, there were people there for as long as 4 years. Could people be staying longer than 4 or 5 years?
I don't anticipate that would be the case at all, and I understand why David's saying that, and we've both been through the experiences of the past together, but that's not what's being anticipated here. And in particular, what we're suggesting is that Nauru and Manus Island would be an initial short-term circuit break while the transitional process is put in place towards other regional arrangements that may include Malaysia or Indonesia, as long as those arrangements can be set in place. And we are able to make recommendations and have control over the length of time that people will stay in those circumstances, and we've made recommendations about provisions for people to come off if it becomes necessary to do so. So it is different to the past. I don't believe that people are going to be there for those lengths of time, but we are saying that a mother and her children who has been assessed by UNHCR in Malaysia or in Indonesia or in Iran or Pakistan a couple of years earlier and were identified for resettlement, their place won't be held off because someone has gone around that process. What we're saying is that they will get an outcome in roughly the same sort of time. That should be the principle. So there's no point in spending the money on smuggling.
Okay, just to deal with that principle, the panel came to the conclusion that a no advantage principle should apply to people arriving here by boat, so that they gain no benefit by choosing to circumvent regular migration mechanisms. Does that mean that Philip Ruddock was right to say all those years ago that those coming by boat were queue jumpers?
No, I don't believe in the queue jumping argument. You got to remember, back then there was no regional arrangement. There wasn't an enhanced humanitarian program. There were no adequate processing structures across the region for people to actually apply into. So there wasn't really a queue. And this isn't talking about establishing a queue, but it is talking about establishing a credible system that people now can apply through. That didn't exist previously. And so what was occurring historically was there was more of a deterrence-based, which had more of a punitive element to it, in order to dissuade people. Now, I know why they did that, but this is an attempt to try and evolve that process.
What makes you think it will stop the boats? Won't some asylum seekers think that there's a good chance that they'll eventually get to Australia and they'll just have to wait a little while in an offshore processing centre?
But what would the point be of spending $10,000, $15,000, $20,000 of money you don't have in order to achieve that outcome when you would get something similar by applying through a regular process? And the principal issue in our terms of reference was to prevent further loss of life. So you're also saying to people, please don't risk your life. Don't run the risk of drowning.
But if you're in Indonesia at the moment waiting to be processed and to be sent to another country, you don't necessarily end up in Australia.
Well, that's right. And in a fully evolved regional protection arrangement, you would hope that over time other countries would also offer resettlement arrangement places to people. And I believe that countries like the US and Canada and others, if it was part of a credible regional arrangement that UNHCR were also actively involved in, then they would also probably offer to take places as a part of that. And that's something that obviously we want to continue to work towards.
Okay, just finally, the government plans to reintroduce its migration bill tomorrow with amendments into the Parliament. What do you hope happens tomorrow?
Well, what I hope is that all of the parties come together to have a serious discussion. There have been comments made today through a number of different sources, and it was clear that they made those comments without reading the report fully. I heard one comment that was made by one of the political parties that said what we were proposing was to set up a network of detention centres across the Pacific. That is a completely false and inaccurate characterisation of what is in the report, and if the report had been read, it would have been impossible for them to come to that conclusion. So what we're hoping is that people look at this issue seriously, they come to it and consider all of the facts objectively, and they negotiate a way through this. This is providing a basis for that negotiation. It provides an opportunity to stop more people drowning and to save more lives, at the same time giving many more people the protection they deserve out of the region. And that's what we're hoping to create.
Paris Aristotle, thanks very much for talking to us tonight.
Thanks very much, Steve. I appreciate it.